Thank you. We have several guests with us tonight, and we'd like to get them home as they were very gracious to come out tonight in inclement weather. So we're going to have an update tonight. I know on ethylene oxide, myself, Brian, Pat, John, we've all been in various meetings with various entities, and we try to remember to update all of you, and it's always good to try. And we've been trying to update our residents, but we thought by having a session tonight with some of those that we've been working with, so you could hear it directly, ask any questions. It'll give us an opportunity to spread some good information on facts of what we're doing and what the other agencies are doing. So first, you want to add anything?
No.
Before okay.
You covered it.
Well, tonight we are blessed to have Larry Mackey, the Deputy Director of Prevention in the Lake County Health Department, who's going to talk about all the things that the Lake County Health Department's been doing related to ethylene oxide. Thank you, Larry, very much.
Okay, I was told I was supposed to speak directly into this, so
Yes.
I tend to be a little bit on the quiet side, so let me know if you can't hear.
We're taping, so please, yes.
Thank you for inviting me here. This has been an interesting couple days of weather, so hopefully, I was going to say hopefully it's the worst of it, but we're not even close to that. So, but at any rate, thank you for inviting me. As background, just for general information, just a little bit about ethylene oxide as to what it is. It is a gas. It's a colorless gas. It does have a slight odor at fairly high levels in the parts per million levels, but it's used for a couple of different reasons. Mostly, the two reasons that it's mostly used for are to make other products. It's used pretty extensively in making things like detergents and personal care products like lotions and moisturizers and conditioners and things like that. And that's primarily what is done at Vantage here in Gurnee. The other use that is mostly done is for sterilizing medical or dental equipment. It's very effective for doing that purpose because it can be used on plastic items, on paper items, on things like that that are used in surgeries and things. So other sources of ethylene oxide can be found in automobile exhaust, for example. So it's a fairly common chemical in the environment, but it's used primarily in those two uses for industrial uses. People can be exposed to it. It's normally through inhalation, but it is a liquid at up to about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a liquid, and then it becomes a gas. It boils at that temperature, so that people can be exposed to it in that way. But the most common way is through inhalation, rather. In December of 2016. The U.S. EPA reclassified ethylene oxide, or ETO, as a human carcinogen. It was reclassified from a potential human carcinogen based on an analysis that had been done at that point in time, a risk analysis and a safety and toxicity analysis that was done. So the classification changed at that point in time, and at that time also, there is a thing called the National Air Toxics Assessment, and it's a NATA, or NATA, depending upon your pronunciation. And what that is that's an online map that the US EPA publishes that is it gives a potential for concern. It's basically designed as a screening tool, and it's supposed to help local, federal, state governments see where there's potential for some increased risk. So the 2014 maps are the most recent maps, and those were adjusted at that point in time to recognize the fact that ETO was classified as a much more potent chemical than had previously been thought. And again, those depict areas of potential increased risk. They don't depict known higher cancer rates. They don't predict any, or they do not depict anything other than the risk of a potential increased risk. For reasons that we're not 100% sure of, the area here in Gurnee around the Vantage Specialty Chemicals site was not depicted on that most recent set of maps, and that was because we're told that the EPA did not have the information in the right area in order to get that information, that emission data onto that map. So as a health department, we're not aware of, and we know of no known increases in cancer in these areas, either because we have two sites here in Lake County. There's the Medline site down in Waukegan and then this site here. there's no known areas of cancer clusters or increased cancer rates in those areas. So we became aware of this as a health department in early part of November. It was actually on November 2nd. We had previously not even known of the existence of those two sites, and prior to getting that notification, being made aware of the fact that they were the Medline site was depicted on that map. At that time, the big interest was in Sterigenics site in Willowbrook, and again, we became aware of it at that time. So we immediately began investigating this. This was something we were not familiar with as a department. While it's a very commonly used chemical and a known chemical, it's not something that we were immediately aware of. And that's largely because the EPA, both the Illinois EPA and the US EPA, are the agencies that have responsibility and authority in matters of chemical emissions and chemical use and permitting for these sorts of things. So US EPA is primarily responsible for setting standards for the emissions and for the safety factors and the risk analyses and all that. And then the Illinois EPA is primarily responsible for issuing permits and regulating the emissions of these chemicals. So they work in tandem with one another, and they are the regulatory agencies. So Lake County Health Department doesn't really have a role in the regulation of these, and our role that we assumed or started fulfilling as of November when we became aware was really to work with the regulatory agencies, with local governments such as yourselves, with the communities where we could, to try to get information, act as a conduit between the various EPA, US EPA and Illinois EPA and these other various agencies in order to try to understand this and get the information out the best we could, and sort of to work as a liaison with the goal, obviously, of protecting the health of the people in the communities of Lake County. So we've had quite a bit of contact with the Illinois EPA and with US EPA. We've had at least 3 conference calls that have had both Illinois EPA and US EPA or Illinois EPA on the phone, where they were providing this information. As a health department, we have had our representatives, including our executive director, visit both of the sites, the Vantage site and the Medline site, and meet with the operators of those facilities and to get a better understanding of how they use these chemicals, what their processes are, and how their emissions are controlled. I attended, along with several people in this room, a meeting down in Chicago at the US EPA where they provided quite a bit of information. There was a representative from US EPA in Washington on the conference, on a video conference line. A lot of information was shared at that meeting. We also, as a health department, we requested and received information on the emission levels, the permitted emission levels, and the actual emission levels from the facilities here in Lake County, and we did receive and analyze those, and found that both of the facilities here in Lake County had emitted ethylene oxide at levels below what was allowed in their permit at that time, their current permits. So what do we know to this point? What have we learned from this? So one of the things we requested and was done was that the US EPA set up a web page for Lake County. Lately, over the last few weeks, there hasn't been a lot of activity, partly because of the partial government shutdown. If you go to those pages, you'll see a little message on there that says that they have not done much updating on that, but they did at least have some information. They've got some frequently asked questions, some good information on there. They did a similar thing. They had done a similar thing for the Sterigenics site in Willowbrook. The other thing that we've learned through our interactions with the US EPA and the Illinois EPA is that both the Medline site in Waukegan and the Vantage site here in Gurnee have voluntarily opted to install some additional controls to reduce their emissions. And right now, what we're being told is the plan for those installations at both facilities is sometime toward the end of first quarter of this year, so sometime in the spring. Whether or not that can be accomplished depending upon what the weather does the rest of this winter, but the plan is, that may be delayed, but the plan is for the spring of 2019 that there will be additional controls to reduce those emissions. Again, the information that we received from the Illinois EPA was that the emissions currently, prior to the additional controls, were below the allowed limits within their current permits, but I understand those permits were issued under standards that were previously set by the US EPA prior to this reassessment of ethylene oxide as a carcinogen. So there has, the people at Vantage have also told us and the EPA that they plan to do some air monitoring at their site. They're calling it fence line monitoring, so they're going to do some air testing there. That some of that has been done right now around the site in Willowbrook, the Sterigenics site, but sticking to Vantage right now. Our recommendation was to do some before and after testing. It seems at this point that the Vantage, since it is a voluntary step that they're taking, that they want to do testing after they've put in the emission controls. We'll continue to talk with them about that. There are some issues with testing in general in the air for ethylene oxide. We're looking at very, very low levels. The equipment now that's available for testing can test down into the low parts per million. So in the fractions of a single digit. So down to perhaps less than 1 part per million, but not much lower than that. The safety levels that US EPA has currently indicated on their risk assessment is in the parts per trillion, which is a factor of 1,000. And so the question is that I've had for EPA is, how do we reconcile the ability to test at the parts per million level and perhaps having some risks at the parts per trillion? And quite honestly, that's a question that they said that they are working on right now. And I said, well, how do we convey this information to the public? And they basically said, well, that's something that no one really has an answer to right now. The other thing that's a little bit of a complicating factor is no one really knows, and we just had a recent conference call, it was January 17th with Illinois EPA, and I specifically asked the question, what are the known background levels of ethylene oxide in the atmosphere? So if we went out to the middle of a forest preserve here in Lake County or in an area that was in a subdivision, what would be the background levels one would expect to find there? And no one knows that. There hasn't really been research on that, and so people don't really know that. So there's going to have to be some additional information gathering there. So I did indicate that around Sterigenics there has been some testing, and it's on the website now. If you go to the US EPA, if you Google just US EPA Sterigenics Willowbrook, you can go to the site and see their test results. The most recent results that I found as of last week, I did not check today, as of last week they had their results up there from the month of November, and there were, I believe there were approximately six samples collected in the area immediately surrounding that site down there. There were two sites that had detects in the range of up to about 6 parts per billion. That was immediately on the site and that was immediately adjacent to the site. There were about 4 or 5, I can't recall the exact number, sampling sites around that area, within a couple thousand feet of that area, and none of those had detects. But again, our detect level is down to about around a part per billion, or a fraction of a part per billion. Another complicating factor is that currently the OSHA standard for workers at these facilities is 1 part per million. So that the safety level that they have currently set with OSHA is a part per million. We're able to test in the air likely down to the parts per billion, but the safety factor may be depending upon the interpretation of the risk assessment in the parts per trillion. So those are factors. When you start talking about all these kinds of numbers, each one of those is a factor of 1,000 difference. So a trillion is a million. So there's a large difference between a million and a trillion. So again, these are very large numbers, big, complicated factors. In fact, when our call with the Illinois EPA on the 17th, my question was specifically, again, what was their recommendation? How is the best way to try to convey this to the public? And the response that I got was, well, that's the question that we're all struggling with, and we're all trying to get an answer to. So the other thing that actually we had learned at the meeting down in Chicago with the US EPA is that they do plan to do some modeling around the Sterigenics site. So again, I raised a question to them at that meeting, and you may recall. I said, do you have any information on if the emission rate at point A is X level, what is what is the expected exposure rate to a person who's 1,000 yards away or 2,000 yards away or 100 feet away? Do they have that data? And they currently don't, but they did indicate at that meeting that they were going to do some modeling in that to try to make those determinations. And it is tricky again because atmospheric conditions change. Exposure times and levels are difficult to pin down, but they are going to try to do some of that modeling on that. So that if that gets done, that will be instructive to the other sites around the country. Obviously, if you can talk about similar weather conditions, similar exposure levels, similar emission levels, rather. The other thing that was mentioned on the most recent call on the 17th, again, kind of to follow on the discussion of, how do we reconcile the difference between, 1 part per million versus perhaps a tenth of a part per trillion. And the Illinois EPA said that the US EPA folks that did the what's known as IRIS, the risk assessment, may look at those numbers again to see if there was any, if there was cause for reassessing or trying to redetermine if those numbers. I know that the industry has requested that to be done, so we'll see if there is going to be a reassessment there to try to reconcile some of that. The other thing that's currently pending is there's possibility of legislation both at the state and federal levels to further restrict the use or in some cases just to place greater requirements on reporting if there are emission levels that violate a standard or violate a permit requirement. So there were a couple bills floating around right at the end of the last session. I'm not sure where they're standing right now. I know there were a couple that were more likely to go than others, and I know there was also legislation filed at the federal level. And that legislation at the federal level was aimed primarily at causing or requiring US EPA to reassess and perhaps reset emission standards. Because again, there's not a real connection, a definitive connection. Well, there is a connection, obviously, but there's not a definitive connection between if X number of pounds, again, are emitted here through a stack versus what that exposure level is. And so EPA is supposed to, or would be required by this legislation to reset those, because according to EPA in the conversations that we've had with them, there is no current requirement for them if a risk assessment of a chemical changes, that there's no mandate currently that would require them to reassess their emission standards. So we've gathered a lot of information. There's still a lot more to be gathered, and again, a very difficult part of this is trying to convey risk to the public, trying to convey what these numbers might mean, to convey that box that they show on the NADA map is a potential for exposure or a potential for increased risk, but not necessarily. So risk is a very difficult thing to try to describe, and so that's what we're trying to do as a health department, to try to maybe parse out some of this information and make it a little bit more understandable and a little bit more digestible for everyone, so that we can have a better understanding of what we really are looking at here.
Thank you, Larry. Trustee Thornton, you had a question about water?
I do, thanks. Thank you very much. I think that was very helpful, and I liked that you said that you're leveraging the background testing over in Willowbrook and staying on that theme in terms of kind of lessons learned. Are you working with, is it DuPage County Health Department that governs Willowbrook?
Yeah, in fact, we've got a really good working relationship with the people there. I know their environmental health director down there is Kevin Dixon, and I was co-chair of our NIPIC, the Northern Illinois Public Health Consortium Environmental Health Committee. I was co-chair with him for years, so we have a very good working relationship. We've learned a lot about been able to get some advice from them on how they were handling things, and essentially the last conversation I had with them is they're trying to fulfill basically the same role as we are, and we're really in the same situation where we don't really have regulatory authority, but we do have, obviously a strong interest in the health of the people in our respective jurisdictions.
And just, that's good to know that you're working really closely. I noticed that one of the tests that DuPage ran on Willowbrook was some well water testing around the area. Mm-hmm. And have you given any thought about doing the same for us? What
we concluded at the time when they were going to do that testing, The reason why they did that testing was, there was two reasons. First of all, there had been some concern over apparently either some spillage or some leakage of ethylene glycol at that site in Willowbrook in the past. I believe it was in the 90s. Because if you take ethylene oxide, mix it with water, and or increase the acidity, reduce the pH in that, it produces ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze. And in fact, that's the manufacturing process for antifreeze. So apparently, and so at both Vantage and at Medline, that is a byproduct. So the concern was twofold. One was that there had been some concern over that in the past, and then there was some speculation that levels in the air could perhaps mix with water, get on the ground, and perhaps filter down into the groundwater. So they did some pretty extensive testing. In fact, Illinois EPA had some additional money that they provided to DuPage County to do that testing. So our view on that was, because DuPage County has similar geology and similar water wells to what we have here in Lake County, we were going to wait and see what happened there before we really make a decision on whether that would be something we'd want to recommend going forward with here. They got the results there. They didn't find any detects of anything there, so we don't really see at this point cause to pursue that here in Lake County.
Thank you.
Trustee Jacobs?
Can you comment a little bit about the couple of times that Vantage was tagged for a couple of parent violations in 2015 and 2016?
Yeah, there were a couple violations. I didn't explore those. I should have actually done a little bit more research into those. I know the violations that they had were not for emission violations. I'm not 100% sure. I apologize for not having that information, but our people that had FOIA those records had gotten those had said those were plant violations for storage or for I'm not sure exactly what the violations were, but they were not for emissions. That was my primary concern.
Hood?
Just two questions. As far as the emissions level for ETO, does the health department in any way participate in setting that level, or is that entirely an EPA job?
It's entirely EPA. US EPA sets the standards. Illinois EPA issues the permits that establish those emission levels, the allowable levels, and they also are the enforcement agency for assuring that they're happening within those levels.
So my second question is about enforcement. So does the health department have any enforcement ability at all with reference to if they find out that Vantage is exceeding an ETO level, what's the health department's response to that?
If there was a violation of that, we would ask Illinois EPA to enforce their standards on that. They have the ability to issue fines. They have the ability to enforce those standards. The health department really has we don't have any ordinance or statutory authority in those matters. Now, that being said, you're probably aware of the fact that in DuPage County they did file a lawsuit. The county and the state filed a lawsuit for violating pollution standards in general, but that's not something that the health department in DuPage County did, and that's not something that the health department here in Lake County would have the authority to directly enforce those standards. We would again work with, we've got throughout the county there are a lot of other Illinois EPA regulated facilities, such as I'm sure the Village of Gurnee wastewater treatment plant and various public works treatment plants around the county, and there are times that those things are in violation. If we become aware of those things, that we would work with Illinois EPA on enforcement of those.
So as far as the general public and or the board, village board, what would you suggest, or from the health department's perspective, would be helpful for you? I mean, what could the public do, or what could the board do that would be helpful to the health department, if anything?
I think it would be two different things. I think the public, I would encourage them to ask questions and do research, and feel free to contact us at Lake County Health Department. We've got, through our website, you can send an email. There are phone numbers listed. I would encourage them to ask questions about it, because we do have a lot of information. A lot of it I can't package into a 2-page list of bullets. As far as the village here and other units of government around the country, I would say let's keep the lines of communication open. Let's try to work together to get information from both US EPA and Illinois EPA. Let's try to work as a as a team in a sense to try to get as much information as we can and learn as much as we can and try to influence as much as we can where we can. I think we have a lot more ability to do that if we are, if we're a united front on that, because we all have the same interest at heart, in which is, the village here cares about the health of the residents of the village, just as the county and the department care about the health of the residents of the county.
Thanks for your time.
Mm-hmm.
Trustee Balmas?
You had already mentioned it, and I just want to verify. The Lake County Health Department does keep documentation or whatever of cancer within an area so that you know if it's on a rise or if there is a cluster or a cell or whatever you call that?
We don't keep that information per se. That information is kept by the Illinois Department of Public Health and by the state of Illinois, and we periodically can ask for and have asked for information, but it is generally that information is by zip code, and to do a much more detailed analysis, you would need much more detailed information than that. But we have looked at some zip code information in some of the areas, and we've not seen any blips there or anything that have jumped out. We've done those in the past, and we've looked at the numbers and haven't seen anything from what we can. But again, it's a very broad level. But generally, my experience in the past where people have said, the toxicologists and people I've worked with in the past have said where if there is a real hot spot, even within a larger area, it would skew the numbers enough. It should skew the numbers enough. So we've not seen that.
Okay, thank you.
Again, thank you. Trustee Hood had suggested a committee of some sort, and I had a meeting with other area mayors, and we did talk about, for one community to do this by themselves is a lot when it impacts the region. So we had talked about, specifically Waukegan and I and a few of the other communities, creating a committee, for lack of a better word, not just for busy work, but, within a representative in Lake County Health Department, maybe some of our legislators would meet, on a regular basis to share information, best practices, action items, some tactics and stuff. So I'm going to work with some of our neighboring communities and take Trustee Hood up on his generous offer, to lead something like that. So I think when you mentioned, what the public could do and what we could do as entities working together in the lines of communication, that was something that Trustee Hood had brought up that I think has a lot of merit. It may be more ongoing because it's ethylene oxide today, but a few months ago there was another environmental issue, and I'm sure a few months from now we'll have another environmental issue. So it seems like environmental issues, the public's more sensitive to them, or there's more awareness. So it could become kind of an ongoing thing to, we have a core group of people that stay on top of it and are knowledgeable and then can share it with the rest of us. Because I know for all of us to be reading the same materials and stuff, to have one person that kind of digs into the minutia and sorts it out. So we may follow up with you to get that going here in the next week or two.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Well, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Well, thank you.
And also a good segue when Trustee Hood was asking you about enforcement. Our village attorney, Brian Winter, wants to walk through for us monitoring the enforcement, the legalities, because that's usually our role is, that we can take some action legally. So Brian's going to kind of walk us through that.
Okay, well, thank you, Mayor. I did prepare a couple slides here just to walk us through a legal overview of regulatory authority with respect to air emissions. If we go to the first slide here, basically, as you might expect, at the top, it is the federal government. So I'm going to present the hierarchy of regulatory authorities, and at the top, under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, there's actually a provision that says the federal government, by acts of Congress, can preempt and become the dominant force in creating regulations and enforcing that. And so with respect to air emissions, that has happened with the Clean Air Act. I have a slide that will come up and we can talk a little bit more about the act itself, but that is at the top of the list. So everyone has to understand the concept of preemption, and that is where the federal government steps in and says it is going to regulate. And there's another slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that concept. Second is the state. We have 102 counties. They're all depicted on this map. And it turns out under the Clean Air Act, there are some provisions under that federal legislation that allows the state to actually submit plans to implement the Clean Air Act. And we'll talk about that a little later too. But those are the two main agencies that control air emission regulations. If we go to the next slide, we have the logo of Lake County, and you've heard from a representative. Basically, the county, it does have a public health department that was created by referendum in the 50s. It has approximately 1,000 employees. They got a $70 million budget, and it's a great department, and it addresses many public needs throughout the county, but also they do assist municipalities in all sorts of areas. So it isn't just on air emissions, but as you've heard the report, they are looking into this. But they are the third rung down, and I concur, they don't have any regulatory authorities, which brings us to the local government. And basically, I put the map up there just to show you we have 52 villages, or at least portions of 52 villages and cities that are either entirely located within the county or portions. And basically, 18 are home rule, because I know a discussion has come up from time to time among many people as to whether or not home rule gives the village certain authorities that they could impose with regards to the usage of ethylene oxide within the village. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think what this map does show is it's not, the village of Gurnee is in red here, and you can see these are unique borders. And what that means is these unique borders are often good in terms of addressing local needs, like roads, like zoning, like building codes, and police and fire. For the same reason, these abnormal boundaries do not lend themselves for presenting a regional approach to things like water that go through different boundaries and air. And that's something that we as representatives of the village have to understand and hopefully convey that to the public, that there's going to be inherent restrictions on what villages can do, because air is not something that is unique. The air above our heads right now or outside, that's not something that is unique to Gurnee. If we go to the next slide, again, this is a concept that, you know, I can say preemption, and I don't necessarily have the expectation that everybody knows what that means, but maybe these are some examples so that you can understand. It first started out with the Clean Water Act. We now have the Clean Air Act. The FDA, we all know about how they regulate drugs, and we understand why they're doing that, and municipalities and states aren't doing that. Railroads and in general interstate commerce is something that is controlled at the federal level. For instance, we cannot set the speed limit for the tri-state. Local authority does not extend to the village to do that. More recently, there's been revisions to even mortgage documents through the Dodd-Frank Act. I have the highway traffic study up there. I should add this, that the American Bar Association did a study of areas where federal preemption exists, and they came up with over 340 pieces of legislation and regulations that they could identify. So this is a concept that affects our lives all the time, and so hopefully people are not surprised to hear that this is an area where federal preemption occurs, and those are some common examples of that. So if we go to the next slide, here we have the CAA, the Clean Air Act, and again, This is where Congress steps in and actually says, we want to have preemption. Now, I should also explain, this is just a brief overview. There are different types of preemption. There's field preemption, express preemption, implied, cooperative, and sufficient for our discussions is just to know that preemption has been invoked when it comes to clean air. It was enacted in 1970. There's been 2 major amendments to it, and its mandate is very clear: to protect air resources, to promote the public health and welfare. And the Act itself does talk about ambient air quality standards. So that's something that's within the Act, but the Act goes on. If you look further down on this slide, it does provide that the U.S. EPA actually can delegate authority to achieve these standards among the states. And each state can submit what they call an SIP, a state implementation plan. And basically that plan, because each state has, maybe topography is different. So in implementing these standards, some of these standards are to alleviate smog, some are to alleviate greenhouse gases. And we can all think of examples where, like for instance, California, where you have a coastal area and a mountain range, that there could be different approaches in administering the standards and different ways at looking how you're going to alleviate particular air quality issues that relate to the terrain of the state. The thing to point out here, though, is the U.S. EPA doesn't relinquish totally their control. They say, states, submit a plan, we still have to approve it. And then also, by and large, though, under these plans, it is then the state that is actually the entity that is issuing permits. If we go to the next slide, I do want to emphasize that there is even a local component here, because basically, and I'm not suggesting that it's an expansive involvement, but it is clear under the Clean Air Act that there's provisions for consultations, not only with states, but with local, the local public and local entities. And in some cases, particularly with new permits, there is a requirement to have public hearings, and that certainly gives public input. So villages aren't necessarily shut out, but it does have a very, very limited role. But again, there have been many questions about home rule. And so I have included a couple slides about home rule. Basically, back in 1970, and it became effective in 1971, we received a new state constitution. And as in Article 7 of the state constitution, it has a section 6A, and this is the actual wording of that. It says home rule units may exercise any power, any function, and any function pertaining to its government and affairs, including but not limited to the power to regulate for the protection of the public health, safety, morals, and welfare, to license, to tax, and to incur debt. And once this was passed, every municipality within the state of Illinois that had a population over 25,000 became a home rule. There's also a provision for smaller towns. They can become home rule, but they have to pass a referendum. And actually, we have 3 municipalities in the state that have had passed referendums to revert back to non-home rule. But generally speaking, sometimes people look to this to say, doesn't this give municipalities additional power? And the underlying language, if we go to the next slide, I can tell you that this has been a source of a lot of litigation and interpretation. And basically, it's this key phrase of this empowering part of the Constitution that's always interpreted in those cases. And it says, pertaining to its government and affairs. Well, think of that as the village's government and affairs. And there are many cases that say, look, there's limitations, that basically it has to be something that uniquely can be addressed at the local level. That if the municipality is attempting to regulate in essence, supersede state regulations or go beyond their boundaries, that is not going to be permitted. And some of those cases even cite to some of the debate that occurred at the time of the passage of the new state constitution, and I've included that because this has appeared in court cases, that they basically, the drafters of the new constitution understood that items such as the control of air and water pollution, floodplains and sewage treatment are often cited as important examples of areas requiring regional or statewide standards and control. And so basically, this is the reason why home rule municipalities up to this point have not enacted air emission regulations. They don't have the authority to do that. In addition to that, I have a last slide on this particular issue. There's another article in the state constitution, and that's Article 8. Again, I give them credit for brevity. They don't say a lot about this, but this ends up being the language that the courts rely upon that says, states, you have the primal authority to regulate. In addition, I mean, they recognize the federal government, that's always the top. Pop culture is not often, doesn't give you a true portrayal of law. But when you watch those cop shows and the FBI steps in, that's federal preemption. They are higher than the local authorities. But again, this is another piece to the analysis to say, really, it is the states. And so I'll end with this slide because, Jack, if you could move to the last slide there. I've told you that the Clean Air Act does provide for consultation. I can also report to you that the US EPA and the IPA has been in consultation with the village. And that's something that, as you heard from the previous speaker, the thought process here is that will continue. And that's very important because essentially, as part of those consultations, the US EPA has made the request of the village that probably the best way for the village to approach this is to keep that line of communication and also to refer your residents to a website that they've set up. Now, admittedly, we have urged them, and some of these updates have not happened for reasons beyond their control, but they have assured the village that the US EPA will be a good clearinghouse because A, it is their responsibility to to set and enforce the regulations, so it only makes sense that they should have a website to address this issue, and that will be updated in the future. Second, as part of these consultations, this does give an opportunity for not only the village, but the property owners and facilities that are using ethylene oxide. It gives a conduit for discussions, and basically the meetings that the village has had with the US EPA, we have indicated to them, first we've asked, is there anything that you want the village to do? And then we also include in those meetings that we understand that in this case, Vantage has agreed to do perimeter testing for a month-long period of time. And we asked the US EPA, are you willing to look at the protocol before they start that test so that you are convinced that they are conducting that test the best way that they can make that test? And the US EPA said that they were in contact with Vantage and that they would be reviewing the protocol before it was implemented. I can also share with you, we asked them in terms of the duration of the testing, and the US EPA said that for a month period of time was actually very unusual, that's a very comprehensive, and they expect that to be a good measure of testing, and they were impressed with that. And so that is something that I think local involvement had some role to play on that. And again, they said that they would be evaluating the results. And I can understand skepticism in terms of if Vantage is paying for that, is that going to be accurate? I can tell you that Vantage is not going to be doing the testing, that the village certainly expressed to the US EPA, and the US EPA understands this as well, is that they're going to have qualified, licensed people to conduct this testing. They're going to be certifying to everyone, including the US EPA, that they are reporting all of the test results that they made. So this is not an opportunity for the property owner to withhold information. They have to conduct the test according to the approved protocol, and they have to provide the results. And so the last effort, and you might be hearing more about this from another speaker, but because they're the two major agency, there's no question, federal is at the top of the list. But with that aspect of state intervention, there is also the opportunity of our state legislators to look at this issue. And I can tell you that there's been some acknowledgement, at least from the US EPA, that, and everyone, that you have to update standards. If there are health risk studies that come out, certainly there has to be a response to that. And as part of that response, in the last session, we're beginning a new session, so there's going to be new bills that will be advanced in Springfield coming up. That's another role that the village can have a part in. Certainly there are public hearings, and the village can send letters of support or comments, witness slips to those proceedings, and that, again, we believe that that is an appropriate response for the village to keep itself abreast of what new legislation could be proposed, and whether from any of the sources, whether it's from the US EPA, whether it's from the county, that they can also weigh in to give assistance. So that's basically a relatively short overview of the legal process.
Thank you very much, Brian. Questions from the trustees? I know a lot of you had an opportunity to communicate with Brian, but I thought it was good for the record, so we're all on the same page about what our authority is. If there's no questions, then I am honored tonight to have our State Senator Melinda Bush here with us. We've had a lot of conversation. Melinda has been actively involved with this issue since the beginning. And yes, go to the microphone. I asked her to be here tonight, and then one of the reasons we started early with the report is she needs to get back to Springfield too, and we know what the weather's like. Melinda, thank you so much.
Happy to be here. So I think we've all learned a lot more about ETO, ethylene oxide, than we knew a few months ago. I'm sure you know that it's one of the top 10 traded commodities in the world. So it's a product that is used in a gas that's used in many different manufacturing efforts. But what we're mainly talking about is the use in sanitizing medical equipment. I know you also have Vantage, which is a bit different. But anyway, let me kind of update you where we're at. So I'll let you know what we're doing legislatively. So at the end of session, we're starting a new General Assembly. That happens every 2 years. At the end of session, there were a couple of bills that were introduced in the House. We have a senator who represents the Willowbrook area, who frankly has been involved in this issue for probably the last almost year, because the issue first came up there, that there were problems with the emissions from Sterigenics. So he's been involved there. Those bills did not move out of committee. There were certainly some people that didn't think they were strong enough, and others who maybe felt they were too strong. Just so you know, I was named chairman of the Environmental Committee January 18th. So I had a conversation this morning with our environmental groups, and we are definitely talking about moving legislation that will impact the pounds of emissions that are coming out into the air, which really impacts that air quality. We think it's really important that we look at it not just from limiting to 99.9%, but the actual tonnage that's being put out. It's a really important way to look at it. Because if you can imagine, if you limited something to 99.9% and there was 1 million of those things out there, that 99% is a whole lot more pollutants in the air than if there were 500 of those things being put out. So we think that's really important. We're also looking at, within legislation, what needs to be sterilized. Are there things, we know that plastic can't be sterilized by some other methods that are out there now, but metal objects can. So we're looking at those things, those conversations. Again, we had a meeting this morning in Springfield, either this week or next week. We'll be meeting with, we have a new head of our IEPA. We'll be meeting with him, the environmental groups, and some of the concerned parties, so they'll be at the table. At this point, the manufacturers won't be at the table. I want to thank the mayor for making sure to let me know when you were going to be out at Vantage and Medline. It was really important for me, certainly, to see how those gases are used and understand the process. So that's where we're at right now. I do expect that you're going to see much stronger legislation or much stronger regulations than you see at the federal level. We can do that. There are 6 states right now that have enacted stronger legislation that has to do with ETO, ethylene oxide, and we have looked at what those states are doing. We're probably going to take it a step further, but those negotiations are really just starting again. We expect the bill to be filed in the Senate, to start in the Senate this time, within the next couple of weeks. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And I want to also offer that the IEPA, and certainly myself, the state of Illinois, would be happy to bring some of our experts here if you think it's a benefit for us to do some kind of hearing in the community so the residents can attend, ask questions directly. You know, I know that we can make that happen if it's something that you think would be beneficial.
All right, well, we can work on that together, and on behalf of the whole village, your accessibility, being available to meet and call, listen to our concerns, has been invaluable. I really
thanks.
appreciate
It's my
it.
job.
Yeah, I know. It is your job, and it's our job, but just the collaboration and the cooperation and the communication has just been outstanding.
Thank you.
To make sure that we're all taking care of the right authorities are doing what they need to do for public safety.
And I'm really happy to answer any questions. And truly, if you believe that's something, and we can talk about that later, that the village would like to participate in with Waukegan and some maybe other surrounding communities, I'm happy to start those conversations when I get in the car later.
All right, questions from Trustee Ross?
Do you have some engineers that are helping with the deliberation too? Because I think that sometimes some of the conversations and when you're talking about it, it's a little hard for the layperson to understand.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm not an expert. You know, I'm certainly not a chemist either. I mean, for me, I've learned a lot about ETO, but I wouldn't even presume to begin to call myself any kind of expert. So absolutely, Cheryl. And I can promise you, too, that we do have the conversations with manufacturers. It's very important for us to understand things from their perspective, too. Not because, look, my job, my first priority here, and I promise you, is public health. You know, and that is job one. But when we do those things, we also have to make sure, or when we're trying to pass legislation, that we understand how the manufacturers use these products. Are there other products that are available? And frankly, today, there isn't a replacement for ETO when it comes to the sterilization of plastic products. So there are some work that's being done out there. But at this point, it's a gas that permeates. So at this point, there's some promise of some new things coming on the market, but at this point, there isn't. And there's no one, just so you know, because when we first started looking at this, we had heard that the European Union had banned ETO. That's not the case. There isn't a country or a state that has banned ETO. But we believe it needs further regulation.
All right, well, I know you and I will talk frequently, but as you move forward with the legislation, keep me in the loop, and we'll do the witness slips.
Yeah, and if there's anybody that's interested, and I know that there's an ETO group that is formed here, I try to frequent their website just to see what they're talking about, and if you have people that want additional information, please give them our office phone number. We're happy to make sure that they know what they can do and sign them up if they'd like communication also.
Okay, Trustee Hood?
Just a couple things. One,
Yeah.
you were just talking about how people can be more involved.
Mm-hmm.
So as a resident in Gurnee, what would you recommend that they do that would make things happen, whether it's more quickly, or what could they do?
Sure. You should always reach out to your legislator. And don't be afraid to do that. I mean, you should make a phone call, find out what they are doing. I mean, frankly, both of these plants are not in my district. My district line is on the other side. But as you so adequately pointed out, air quality doesn't really have that kind of boundary. So reach out to your state rep and to your state senator and your congressman or congresswoman, because obviously they're looking at those regulations. Do that. The other thing is learn how to post on, to slip in favor of a bill or in opposition to a bill. Happy to supply you with a step-by-step how to do that. It's really important because the first thing that happens when we're talking about a bill in Springfield is we say there are 394 people that have slipped in favor of this bill, 400 that have slipped against, and I get a list when I'm looking at that bill, and I can tell every organization, every person, and that does matter. It does matter. So I think it's really important that your residents and yourself, look, you're truly, your village does a really good job of communicating with us and making sure that we know what's going on here and what we can do to better serve the residents of Gurnee. But I think the residents of Gurnee can better help serve themselves if they get involved in the process by making sure they're looking at what's going on and slipping in favor of some of those bills.
And one other question as far as legislation is concerned, where do you see it going? Just as residents, what do you see actually happening? Because there's certainly a strong desire from residents to see zero ETO versus what do you think is going to come out as legislation?
So I can give you my opinion, but that's certainly all that it is, because there will be a lot of people at the table as we're trying to move this through. I expect the bill to be carried by Senator John Curran. I spoke with him this morning. I think it's best that he carries the bill. He represents the Willowbrook area. I'll be signing on as a sponsor of the bill, but it'll be going through the Environmental Committee. I want to be able to help negotiate. I don't believe you're going to see an immediate ban. I don't. I believe that you may see a ban that would take place over time with some caveats. I think that's a possibility. But some of the other things we talked about, I think it's going to be a good piece of legislation. I mean, I truly do. I think it's, everyone won't be happy, but I think we will be protecting the public as best as possible, and I believe that we'll be addressing most of those issues. I think we'll get to 99.9 and tonnage, and I think we'll get to a ban in particular areas pretty quickly. And possibly a ban completely over time.
Thanks for that information.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Trustee
And don't be
Jacobs?
putting that all in the paper, Jim. Anyway, just kidding.
Trustee Hood asked what the residents can do to help with this process. From the standpoint of the board and the
Yeah.
mayor, is there anything else that we as a board and the village can be doing with regard to this process?
So you guys really have been on all of those calls. I haven't been on all of them personally. My staff has been on some of them. We've been on all of them also. I just think that, look, send me an email. Truly, ask me a question. If there's anything that I can do to provide you with more information, request what you need from us, truly. You should be calling me too and asking, is there, when should I get involved? You can also, I'll make sure that you know who are the people that have the bills. You can be reaching out to them directly too, the people that are carrying the bills. You can also look and see who are the organizations, and maybe there really won't be any villages, they'll mainly be organizations that will be objecting to the bills. So if we let you know who those are, sometimes you can reach out to those also. So that's a way certainly to be helpful. And please feel free, if you have someone that is asking you about what the state of Illinois is doing when it comes to ethylene oxide, and what are we doing when it comes to those emissions and standards for both Vantage and Medline, please feel free to give them my office phone number. I'm happy to answer their questions.
I know you are. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we're very active with the witness slips and that. I use that very judiciously to make sure when I do it, it's an important piece of legislation that benefits our community. I don't do it on every bill, but we have used it, so we can walk you through that process too if you want to set up your own accounts so that you can do witness slips on your own, or we do an appearance notice and go down and meet with the legislators.
And truly, Trustee Jacobs, you should feel free to do that anytime.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yep.
All right, well, I hope your house is warm and
I
safe
know.
travels back to
I sent a
Springfield.
text to the mayor and I said, gosh, I hope I'm going to be there. I got home and my furnace wasn't working.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's working now.
Very
Love
good.
Dan. Okay.
Well, especially safe travels back to Springfield.
Yeah.
I know you got a lot of work to do with the new
We
administration
sure
and
do.
everything.
We sure do. Thank you
So
so
thank
much.
you.
And
Thank you.
truly, reach out anytime. Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up. It's funny who you meet in an airport at 10 o'clock at night waiting for luggage. I had a long conversation with Congressman Schneider last week at O'Hare, and he assured me, I expressed our concerns and what we'd like to see happen, and he gave me a heads up, the letter that did come out the next day, and that they have not lost sight of this despite the government shutdown and some of the other theatrics that are going on at the federal level. Congressman Schneider is working with us side by side too, and has offered to come and be involved in a town hall meeting, so that too. Next, we want to hear from Chief Kavanaugh. There has been some mischaracterization at previous meetings at the public microphone about hazmat response and how it would be handled. So I asked Chief Kavanaugh to kind of walk us through our emergency response and how he interacts with Vantage, or our department interacts with Vantage. Thank you, John.
Okay. As part of the department's community risk reduction program, we go around and we identify all hazards on an all hazards basis, like target areas we have in town, such as chemical plants, schools, Six Flags, Gurnee mills. We've got about 25 large areas that we concentrate on. What we do with these areas is we go through them at least once a year on a formal walkthrough with training. So these are areas we see as target. Of these, about 9 are chemical plants, and specifically today we're here to talk about Vantage. So we go annually out to Vantage. We walk through the entire corporate area out there. We get a guided tour. We also then engage in some sort of training activity. So over the years, we've worked on their tank farm. We've flowed water out there. Other years, we go out there and we do some monitoring and metering. Now, we can't specifically meter for ethylene oxide, but we can meter for flammability and oxygen. We carry 4 gas meters. So the department has, when we respond out there, a meter in our hand that allows us to know if there's some sort of leak. And this happens for all our chemicals. It's set up to 4 basic chemicals. We're able to get a reading where we're at. So that's one of the things that we do every year out there. Kind of going back to the department and how are we prepared to respond to one of these. The department has 9 hazardous material incident commanders. That means by the state law and federal law, they're allowed to be in charge of a scene of a hazardous material incident. So we're prepared there. We have 6 additional what they call hazardous material technicians. These are people that you see kind of in the larger overgrown suits, plastic suits, so they're allowed to go around the area. As long as you're all aware, we're members of MABUS Division 4, which brings in 2 specialty trucks that has numerous other meters beyond what we have. Area meters, so we can set up metering around perimeters. We can look at that. Once again, none of them are chemical specific, but they all look for flammability, lack of oxygen, all the different things that chemicals would give off, so we'd be able to respond there. So when we look at these items and we're looking at these fixed properties, one of the things that we look at emergency responders is, do they have a safety team in place? And Vantage does. So when we go out there, we're always met right at the gate by a member of the safety team from Vantage. They always know where the leak is, what potential chemicals are involved. If it's a fire alarm, they can identify, and they actually have a response team that would come in with us and be the local experts. To this point, we've never had a chemical leak with ethylene oxide there. We've done training scenarios on this, as we have with our propane facilities and all the other facilities in town. So we have that ability to do that. The other nice part about Vantage, they have a pump house there. So part of their tank farm outside, so if you can imagine the large propane tanks that we have in town, they actually have one of those filled with ethylene oxide. This is surrounded by a water deluge system that is run by its own independent pump house that's run by a large diesel pump that increases the pressure. So unmanned, we're able to already be flowing water that normally would take a fire engine to be able to flow here. A good example of this is 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, when we had our large propane fire here in town. That propane didn't have a deluge system around it. We had to come in, we had to set up monitors, we had to flow water. We actually brought foam trucks in from the airport, the Round Lake Airport, Campbell Airport, brought them in, and we were able to flow foam. Now, that same size tank of ethylene oxide and propane, when we started to do our evacuations, we initially started with a half-mile evacuation, and if you get a large fire with either of these chemicals, propane, ethylene oxide, you would, at some point, evacuate out to a mile. This isn't unique to ethylene oxide. We have probably 4 or 5 different chemicals in town that if you actually had a very large spill or leak or fire, you would evacuate to this. This doesn't mean 1 mile would be leveled in any way. This is evacuation for precautionary reasons. No different than if we have a railroad derailment and a tank car was there, or we have something turned over on one of our highways. We would still have that same evacuation area. In fact, I was talking to a couple of the trustees kind of on the side, and they were asking, how do we feel about these fixed properties versus things on railways and highways? And the nice part about the fixed properties is that it allows us to have the suppression system, the alarm system, everything in place. We feel very safe with them because they're in town. Now, we take them very serious. We call them, as we said, target areas that we review every year, and we go through the practices there. Those we can plan for. It's the things we can't plan for. I believe it was about 7, 8 years ago, we had a large fire in the back of a semi-trailer parked next to a factory in town here. And when we came up to it, we started spraying water on it, and the flames started getting larger and larger and larger. Well, what happened was this was an undocumented alcohol fire. It was actually racing fuel that was in here. Someone was illegally selling racing fuel out. We went through, Brian was involved, we went through after the property owner. We were reimbursed for all of our time and everything since this is a hazardous material, we have a spill or pay here. But the risk to the firefighter and the community by this not being documented was much greater than one of these fixed properties where everything's documented and in place and there's training programs in place. So one of the things I was asked, to talk about tonight was the emergency preparedness, how we feel from a safety standpoint with this in our town. The same as we feel with all our chemical companies. We take it very serious. We respond with a full response. We're fortunate we carry Class A and Class B foam on all our fire engines, which gives us an added advantage when we're coming into these. We're able to suppress vapor and keep things down. So we're feeling good there. We have modern meters. We're able to test for this. We're able to see leaks. We feel very good about the fixed property there. And as far as Vantage being a special hazard from an explosion or flammability, it's no greater than other chemicals we have in town. And we feel like we're in a good place right now to respond there. So that's kind of a real quick overview of where we're at on Vantage. I'm open to questions if you have specific questions about it.
If, we've been made aware that if there's a leak at Vantage, they have to report within so many hours or so many minutes to US EPA?
15 minutes.
Within 15 minutes to US EPA if they have a leak greater than 10 pounds at one time. Do they have to report to us, or does the US EPA notify us?
So it depends what type of leak. If it's a one-time leak that is just a reportable leak, that goes to the state. They then give it down to county EMA, and then it comes to local EMA. So it does come to my desk, and I'm aware of any leaks that happen in town. If there's ever a train derailment in town, same procedure happens in place. Even if there's not a chemical spilled, it's reported from the state to the county to us. Now, if this was a leak that started setting off detectors or anything like that within our facility, that would trigger alarms that we would go out as an emergency response and come in with our meters, as I explained, and we would start metering. We've never had a response like that. We've never had a leak that set off their monitors that are in place specifically sniffing for ethylene oxide.
So we would be called in on that type of leak?
Oh yes, if it was a large leak, something started off-gassing, it would set off all their alarms there, we would respond out there. If it's something that they feel like they can't account for some poundage of leak, that there has to be reportable, that goes to the state and down. We've never received anything like that from Vantage up to date.
All right. Other questions from the trustees, or? And I certainly would let the public know that we do have an emergency response, unlike what was said previously. Mr. John?
You just asked my question.
Thank you.
so
Okay.
you.
I know you guys prepare a lot and train for this, and I think it's good to let the public know, considering what had been said before, so thank you very much. Any questions in general or statements from the trustees?
Sure.
Trustee Jacobs?
Yeah, I do have a statement. Let me just say that each and every one of us here on the village board shares the same concerns that our residents have over ETO. We all live in the village. We've all had experience that are not dissimilar to each of our village residents. We've all raised or are raising our children here. Each of us has a family member or knows somebody that was perhaps ravaged by cancer. In my case, it was my wife. Thank God she is in remission. Was it ETO? Was it genetics? We'll never know. What do we know? What we do know is that the ETO issue is one of great consequence that needs to be addressed. The air we breathe is governed by the Clean Air Act of 1970. Specifically, the Act and its amendments give the EPA authority to control 187 toxic pollutants, including ETO. Much of the enforcement of the Act is left to the states. In Illinois, this is left to the Illinois EPA, who has the tools and resources to enforce the Act. Reporting, as we've learned tonight, is left to a more local level, specifically the county. Earlier today, I reviewed the county's comprehensive report on air quality, which was prepared in 2014. The county's 2014 report does not mention ETO, and apparently it was for the reasons that Mr. Mackey mentioned to us earlier tonight. A later report, as I questioned Mr. Mackey on, suggests a violation by Vantage. However, that violation was limited to two incidents of late reporting. At that point, there was no concern that Vantage was outside of the legal limits for emissions. That is not to say that Vantage is currently in compliance. I'm pleased to see that the village staff has been proactive in garnering information from Vantage as it plans to, and its plans to reduce ETO emissions. Is our plan or is Vantage plans perfect? I don't know. It's certainly a step in the right direction. I believe we need this to be one of many steps in order to reach a solution. While some may not see this as ideal, the village cannot afford to take a knee-jerk reaction to this issue. The village needs to have all of its data gathered, reviewed, and analyzed prior to taking any action. Only then can the village act for the good of the members of our community, a community which includes each of our 30,000 plus residents and each of our 5,000 plus members of our business community. And these actions we take need to be subject to the constraints placed upon us by the EPA and the Illinois EPA as delineated by the Clean Air Act of 1970. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Jacobs.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to add anything?
I'd echo, I think trustee Jacobs did a great job. I think,
Okay.
definitely agree with that.
It's a difficult topic. A lot of learning about the difference between concentration and emissions and how they don't relate, and that one drop is equal to 200 Olympic-sized pools. And Cheryl, even trustee Ross had suggested sometimes you need an engineer to explain things, and sometimes we need a chemist to explain things, and sometimes so it has been quite the learning opportunity, and we'll stay on top of it and continue to work with our legislators.